Lama Padma Songje Malu Gomba de Becher Shoga Kanji Nara Dorji Chang, Chunjun Lame Shabbat, Kanyam Dora Doling Arabs, Kanyam Dora Doling Arabs. So the way to approach, the way to be here, listening to these teachings, and also for myself, the way I should be here explaining these teachings. And we should all adopt this altruistic intention to serve all mother sentient beings from now until they attain enlightenment. And in order to do that in the best possible way, then our wisdom, our ability to know should be directed towards perfect enlightenment. And so listen to the teachings with this compassionate, altruistic attitude, with the intention to awaken to enlightenment, and that you will try to retain these explanations and put them into practice as best as you can. And since in the sequence of this text, the first 3 chapters had to do with adopting or accepting, taking the vow of bodhicitta, which is to awaken to perfect Buddhahood out of compassion for beings. Then it's obvious that then we need to know something to do. We need to know how to conduct ourselves in order to accomplish that vow. As it's taught in the previous chapters, and to renege on that vow, to abandon even a single sentient being, is basically it's the same as lying to the Buddhas, as we took the Buddhas as our witness to that vow. So it even though this training in bodhicitta and taking the bodhisattva vow, it might seem like the sort of the kind of the thing to do as kind of upright people who have a good-hearted people, and so we think that it would be good to kind of have the top shelf good attitude, which would be to enter into the bodhisattva path. But as we've seen there's a weight that implies that we are carrying, and it's very easy to disrupt or destroy or corrupt that noble and beautiful intention to strive for enlightenment for the sake of all beings. And so these 3 chapters that follow the taking of that vow then are practices that ensure that that vow is not lost, does not decline or become corrupted. And of course, in the previous 2 chapters, we learned what it is that does corrupt that vow, the whole assembly of afflictions, mental afflictions, the kleshas, both the 3 or 5 primary poisons of the mind, afflictions, and the 20 kind of secondary afflictions, which are good to know so that we learn how to be more mindful before our afflictions take over. And then that chapter, the 2 chapters on the taking of the Bodhisattva vow, the 2nd and 3rd chapters give us the method to practice the Bodhisattva way of performing generosity, the first of the transcendent conducts of the Bodhisattva path. And then in the 4th and 5th chapters that we finished, that is Shantideva's teachings on how to practice the discipline, the conduct, the Bodhisattva conduct of discipline, how to practice it. Through heedfulness, mindfulness, and introspection. And so then in this 3rd chapter of this 2nd section, the practice of patience is taught, how to practice patience. And as Shantideva mentioned earlier in the previous chapters, these paramitas of generosity, discipline, patience, diligence, meditation, and prajna and wisdom, there's one way of seeing those, experiencing those, is there's a hierarchical order to them. Each one is more profound than the previous. And that the previous paramita becomes the ground or the basis for the subsequent paramita, so that as a bodhisattva practices generosity, in all its forms with this aspiration on bodhicitta supporting it, then that generosity, as that becomes a paramita, as that becomes transcendent, as it becomes perfected, say, then that becomes a basis for discipline. So discipline is based on generosity, and then likewise, patience is based on discipline. And the subsequent paramita purifies the previous paramita. So as we practice the bodhisattva conduct of discipline, then the generosity becomes perfected. And as we practice, and then that discipline becomes a basis for patience, then practicing patience with the bodhicitta then purifies a discipline, our discipline, and so on, up to same with diligence, which is, diligence means a joy and virtue. When we practice joyfulness in virtue, then that purifies patience. And patience becomes the basis for joy of virtue. And then joy and virtue becomes the basis for meditative stability. And meditative stability purifies diligence. And then meditative stability becomes the basis for prajna, the wisdom, we call sublime knowing. And then sublime knowing purifies meditation, meditative stability. So there's an interdependence between all of the perfections in that manner. The meaning of the word patience which I looked up today just to get the, what do I have? Merriam-Webster, is that something free? So I was going to look up patience, and then the word of the day that came up was leniency. And leniency, that also connects with one of the synonyms for leniency, although it's down the list, is patience, as it turns out. In the Tibetan, patience specifically refers to something that has to do with kind of a tenacious ability to bear with suffering. Leniency carries with it, leniency means kind of having a softening effect. And then, but here, patience really, how we're using it here is more to do with forbearance, forbearing. Because a translation of it. And as we mentioned earlier, for a beginning bodhisattva like us, then, first we should antidote or be nervous about, or not nervous about, we say, fearful, and seek antidotes to anger and jealousy. Those two, for a beginning bodhisattva, anger and jealousy are usually the strongest of the afflictions. And then pride and stinginess. And then finally, ignorance and desire or passion. This is just of general remarks, and we mentioned it before under the talking about the afflictions, the mental afflictions. So patience is dedicated completely to anger. Patience is the opposite of anger. And it's what training in patience is what causes the Dharma to flourish in our hearts. They say, it's said that patience is the soil for the flowers of the Dharma to flourish and spread their perfume. Patience. And because it has to do with antidoting anger, and because anger is our is so heavy and dominant, it's a tough chapter. And Shantideva throws the gauntlet out in the very first verse by saying, all the good works gathered in 1,000 ages, such as deeds of generosity and offerings to the blissful one, a single flash of anger shatters them. This is that's difficult. And it's been, according to the commentary, it's been taken up as in the sense of what did Shantideva mean, although there is a quote in the sutras that that this is a reflection of. Literally here it says, it means good works means a virtue. So all the virtue gathered in 1,000 ages, 1,000 ages here means great kalpas. Great kalpa refers to, let's see if I can remember all these things. You can learn about what a kalpa is in a very good study in Jamon Kongtrul's chapter on the creation of the universe according to the Abhidharma, the creation of the universe according to the Vajrayana, and according to Ati, the great perfection. Each mind has the origin of the universe. And here, of course, Shantideva is drawing from the sutras. And in the sutras, it says this 1,000 great kalpas. A great kalpa, if I remember, there's when we talk about the universe, from the void, from when there is no structure to the universe, then there begins to emerge the consolidation of the elements, the convergence of the various elements of wind and water and earth and fire, heat. And then the universe begins to form. And that takes one intermediate kalpa. And then, I believe, and then sentient beings begin to evolve or devolve. And the formless realms begin to take form, and the form realms begin to take birth, and so forth. And the hell beings, the hell realms, and all basically sentient beings' karma, which has been suspended in the state of void, begins to, the conditions begin to come together for the karma of life to form and to populate the universe. And, oh, really? Okay. And then that takes 19 kalpas, intermediate kalpas. And then there's the age of duration, where there's this, where things are have a duration for 20 kalpas. And then begins the age of things degenerating. And that takes 20 kalpas, intermediate kalpas. And then there's 20 kalpas, intermediate kalpas of the void. And then it starts again. This is basically life. And 80 intermediate kalpas make up a great kalpa. And so 1,000 of those, this as a numerical equivalent, that virtue gathered by offering to the Tathagata, or the blissful ones, means the Sugatas, those who go in bliss, the blissful ones, the Buddhas, basically the completely enlightened ones, making offerings and deeds of generosity and offerings to the blissful ones. All that virtue is destroyed by a moment of anger. So this is just to highlight how destructive anger is. And we can see even in our own small, not kalpas, but we can see in our own the small events of our life that, you know, a good relationship or something can just all the effort and the generosity and love and that can just completely disappear because of anger. So these are of course, these are quotes of the words of the Buddha. But if that's the case, then logically, it wouldn't seem possible then for anyone to attain enlightenment, because all sentient beings are afflicted by anger. And so what's being spoken of here has been commented on. Oh, these are great masters, I was going to say tossed around, but these are great Buddhist scholars and commentaries to the Bodhicharyavatara that have offered suggestions of what this may refer to. And one such suggestion has to do with that well, there's three kinds of virtue. There's virtue that tends towards happiness in samsara, which is not endowed with, that virtue is not accompanied by either skillful means or wisdom. It's just virtuous actions, and the result of that action is results in various happiness, forms of happiness in samsara. And then the second kind of virtue is a virtue that tends towards liberation. And it is accompanied by some wisdom of non-self. And then there is the Mahayana virtue, that is to say, virtue that is accompanied by profound wisdom and vast skillful means. And that virtue is what tends towards perfect enlightenment. It's also called Mahayana virtue. And what the virtue that Shantideva is referring to, it's suggested that has to do with the first kind of virtue, this samsaric virtue, which is just good works, not accompanied by the wisdom of non-self or of emptiness, nor with skillful means. That's one explanation. Another explanation has to do with, well, he mentions here generosity, and generosity and discipline are unique, or the conduct of generosity and the bodhisattva conduct of discipline, these two have a very strong aspect to them of body and speech virtue, the virtue of body and speech. And of course, as paramitas, as the bodhisattva conduct, are also supported by this aspiration bodhicitta. Otherwise, then it's just that virtue tending towards samsara, or tending towards liberation from samsara, not tending towards a perfect Buddhahood. But here, as Shantideva here, these chapters are all about how what the conduct of a bodhisattva is. And so it's suggested then that what is being referred to here is generosity and discipline that have this body and speech aspect to them. And it's that aspect that is shattered or is destroyed, not paramita conduct, virtuous conduct of the Mahayana type, that is mind, that has to do with mind. Mind, the exclusive practice of patience, joy and virtue, diligence, meditative concentration and prajna, wisdom, those all are only about mind training. And that kind of virtue is not destroyed by anger, as in this first verse. But it's the kind of virtue which even Shantideva says here, generosity, and then included is discipline, because those seeds of virtue are shattered insofar as they are carried out by speech and body. So that's one explanation there. Also, it can refer to that all of that virtue will not, there's these different aspects of karma. One aspect of karma is the karma that is required for the completion of an act. Anyway, that what's referred to here is that the good karma, say the wholesome karma of generosity by making offerings to the Buddhas, is not able to be experienced in this lifetime because of the anger. That it's postponed, or that the conditions for it have been shattered. The conditions for it to ripen in this life are not there. A single flash, also, or an instant, says instant. And then there's a big discussion about what an instant is, also in the commentaries. I think I'll leave it at this, which is a teacher. Another commentary says how any virtuous action that is practiced or engaged in, whether it's for just one or two moments, or for a whole session, a whole day, a whole lifetime, that practice of virtue should always be accompanied by the three supreme methods. And we've discussed this many times, but these three supreme methods are that at the outset of an intention to act, then you give rise to bodhicitta and seek refuge in the three jewels, and set up this pure motivation at the outset. Then during an act, then you carry that act out, depending on what it is, free of concepts. And then at the conclusion of that act, then you dedicate the merit of that action, free of the three spheres of a belief or a perception of the agent, the act, and the recipients, all sentient beings who are transferring the merit of a virtuous action to all sentient beings. So basically, a good motivation at the beginning, undistracted practice of the virtue, and then dedicate the merit. If we engage in virtue with those three sacred principles or supreme methods, then all of our virtue is protected, says. That's why in Words of My Perfect Teacher, where you can hear this more extensive teaching on these three supreme methods, that is taught there as how to practice any act, whether it's just the act of, freeing a fly from a spider web, or engaging in a meditation practice, or making an offering, or what have you, that you should always train yourself so that you include these three, what I call sacred principles or supreme methods, as you to accompany any action. Then they are protected. This is okay. So then let's move on. But okay, this I have an outline of this chapter. To make it a little easier to follow. Sometimes the outlines are not so easy, but basically this chapter of patience has three sections. And the first section, which starts with the verse that we just said, the first section is the removal of anger. In other words, it's defining what patience is, which is the removal of anger. And typical of Shantideva, first he's giving reasons why we should, in this case, get rid of anger. And he, in all these chapters, he is persistent at not just selling patience, or selling, heedfulness, or introspection, and just praising it. But also, we should understand the defects of, or the disadvantages of not being patient, which is anger. And what are the disadvantages of not being careful with our physical, verbal, and mental actions? What are the disadvantages of lack of introspection? These kinds of things. So there's always this. We can hear about how wonderful things are and practice with a great sense of elation and enthusiasm, but over time, if we only focus on the benefits of a practice, the fruition, the arising of karma through dharma having hit a vital point and releasing negative karma will cause us to lose interest, or become jaded, or just not be inspired anymore. We can't rely on our inspiration that's caused by thinking how great the Dharma is or how great a certain practice is. We also need to focus, as Shantideva is aware of and has taught here, well, what are the defects of of losing mindfulness? What's the defects of anger? And think about those things, so that when our enthusiasm begins to fade, our fear of the opposite will support us. Sometimes we practice because we want something, and sometimes we need to practice so that certain things don't happen. And so if you notice in these chapters, there seems to be a theme that has to do with both of these aspects. What was I saying? Oh, so first was all the first 10 verses here discuss why it's important to remove anger. And because anger is something that we are so used to, we need to know that. It might be a painful, something's got to give in this chapter. And then the second portion of the text from the 11th verse on is how to cultivate patience. And then later on, there's the third chapter. It's called Training in Respect, respect for beings. Respect for beings. So there's the removal of anger, and then the cultivating patience, which has many subcategories. And then there is the third teaching on respect for others, respect for beings. So that's what these 134 verses cover, just so you have a sense of it. It's not just one long kind of rant. Again, the assumption is you're a beginning bodhisattva. How does a bodhisattva practice patience? How does a bodhisattva relate to anger, which all sentient beings have? So these first section here on eliminating the importance of eliminating anger goes to say, no evil is there similar to anger, no austerity to be compared with patience. Steep yourself, therefore, in patience in various ways insistently. So no evil is there similar to anger. So the problem with anger is that it destroys virtue. And when there's no virtue, then there's only non-virtue from anger. And then our future is not good. We have to only experience the results of negative actions. And so on the path of the bodhisattva, we need virtue. We need to know how to practice what will cause virtue so that we will be endowed with the qualities of the Dharma in order to be able to not only liberate sentient beings, but simply be able to benefit them in a short term without becoming, without misleading them or without relating to others and with a lot of hope and fear. So no austerity, that is to say, no virtue can be compared with patience. It is the supreme virtue. And it's the opposite of anger. So he's introducing patience here. The first verse didn't mention patience, so the second verse mentions patience. So the patience here is the opposite of anger, and it is just as anger is the worst of negative actions, then patience is the best of positive, of virtuous actions. So contemplate that. So then he says, cultivate therefore patience. It's the supreme austerity. It's austerity because you have to put up with something that's that has habitually been a problem for you. So cultivate virtue in various ways, by all means. And those means will be discussed below here, next, below. But he's setting the tone here of like what anger is, what patience is, and how we should choose patience. And then choosing patience, how do we cultivate it? Even prior to even choosing patience, how do we get to choose whether we get angry or are patient? That's the thing. How do we even fit ourselves into that space to choose? Like a Dodrup Chen in his Chidulam chair. This Chidulam chair means carrying happiness and carrying happiness and suffering on the path. He says, when things unwanted land in our lap, if we react to, in other words, when we suffer from something that we don't want landing in our lap, unexpectedly, because we become so attached to suffering that our prajna, our wisdom, our ability to know becomes dimmed. And then we suffer from something unwanted. Not because of something unwanted, but because our ability to know becomes dimmed. And so using Dharma to create a wedge between what occurs to us and our reaction to it. That's the work of the Dharma. Mm-hmm. And that's how we can create this kind of a juncture. Almost we could say that's how you create a precious human birth. You get born into a precious human birth the instant you don't get angry when something happens that you didn't want to have happen. If there's a space there, then you have the cognitive ability to take that unwanted circumstance and spin it in the direction of Dharma. Turn the wheel of Dharma in your own mind. So that's what this, basically, is what this chapter is about. So those, now these, three verses are kind of a description of people, angry people. Those tormented by the pain of anger, in other words, you're never know tranquility of mind. Strangers they will be to every pleasure, they will neither sleep nor feel secure. So when our minds, become irritated by perceived enemies and other people or situations, circumstances, when our minds become irritated and annoyed by those things, then we're giving rise to anger. And if that becomes our habit, then we'll never be able to achieve this tranquility of mind, this calm mind. And it's a calm mind and a contented mind that feels blissful. And through a contented mind, one achieves mental happiness. Strangers will they be to every pleasure. No matter what occurs to an angry person, it's impossible for them to achieve happiness. And even when they sleep, their body will feel insecure, and their mind and body will feel unstable. Even those dependent on, okay, this is now Shantideva, this is a little bit, we'll have to see how this is, a long time ago. He said here, even those dependent on their Lord for gracious gifts of honor and of wealth will rise against and slay a master who is filled with wrath and hate. In other words, no matter what somebody does for you, if they're angry, if they're always angry, at a certain point you will forget that and you will reject them. Or here he's talking about more feudal, nobility, how people were beholden for positions and wealth and so forth by somebody on the upper hierarchy. I suppose it happens now in the battlegrounds of the asuras in like government buildings and things where you get your way and so forth, and then anyway, you can read that and think about your own boss or your own manager or your own supervisor and something. His family, somebody who is angry, then his family and friends he grieves and is not served by those his gifts attract. Of course, this has to do with anger is definitely one of the few, not one of the few, I shouldn't say. Anger is a non-gender specific. In other words, when a person who's angry just makes trouble for everybody because of their abusive, harsh language, and eventually it just turns into acts of violence. And no matter what they do other than that, it doesn't really offset the disturbances and the repulsion that comes in the wake of a consistently angry person. No one is there, all in all, who being angry lives at ease. So basically, that's Shantideva's theme on these three verses here, that a person who's angry is like a vicious, disturbed snake, like a vicious snake, and there's no happiness, and that their anger spreads, can make others angry. So again, the takeaway from these verses are how important it is to be rid of anger. So these verses 3, 4, and 5, we should draw the conclusion that because there's no happiness associated with anger, we need to be rid of it. Then all these ills are brought about by wrath, hatred, that destroys our virtue again. Our sorrow-bearing enemy, as Shantideva set up this, what do you call it, a way of viewing our kleshas, our mental afflictions, as he talked about in the 4th chapter, how kleshas should be seen as enemies, and go to battle with them. And so here again, when we're narrowing it down to anger, he said, because anger destroys virtue, the only purpose of anger is to create unhappiness, both in this life and in the future. There's no other result or purpose to anger than to create our own mind's unhappiness, both in this life and the future. But those who seize and crush their anchor down, those who basically take control of your mind and destroy anger by cultivating patience, will find their joy in this life and in future lives. And the next verse. Getting what I do not want and all that hinders my desire and discontent my anger finds its fuel. From this it grows and beats me down. So again, this also refers to getting what I don't want and getting what others don't want, sort of that are in my family, my group of friends, my sphere of activity, or those on my side, my team. When we don't get what we want, like loss of possessions or other kinds of things that produce discomfort, since we're always looking for comfort and ease from our suffering. And all that hinders us in what we want. In other words, we're seeking basically our well-being. That not getting and being obstructed creates this discontent, which is we get annoyed, we get irritated, and our hatred and anger finds its fuel. From this it grows and beats me down. So contemplate this is interesting sequence. So this is anger here is, we can think of anger like for our body, it's food. When we take food and nutrition, it causes our body to grow. And similarly, unhappiness, being unhappy, causes anger to grow. Causes resentment to grow when we're unhappy. So we must overcome anger. Here, specifically, we must overcome unhappiness, because it's the root of anger. Anger comes about through that loss, that unhappiness of mind. And it's destroyed by anger, all the goodness of our mind. So we need to reclaim and foster and cultivate that happy, wholesome frame of mind. That will prevent anger from having its way. Therefore, I will utterly destroy the sustenance of this my enemy, just like food. It's the food of anger is unhappiness. So this unhappiness, which is like an enemy, it's like if you cut off the food supply of your enemy, then your enemy will no longer will go away. We defeat our enemy by cutting off the food supply, and so cutting off unhappiness, which feeds anger, cutting off unhappiness will not give anger room to grow. My foe, anger, who has no other purpose but to hurt and injure me. So I'll utterly destroy this enemy whose only purpose is to hurt and injure me. Both now and in the future. And again, just to repeat, anger destroys because it attacks virtue, already existing virtue. Even virtue that may have been accumulated by us over thousands of kalpas of serving and being generous to practicing generosity and discipline to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, destroys that virtue, the virtue that we haven't experienced the results of yet. So think of anger as something that will destroy that virtue. It's not that we'll just get depressed and toss and turn all night, but it will destroy virtue that has not yet created, not yet come to fruition yet, that will produce happiness. So again, when you're contemplating these verses, then make again a resolution and a determination to uproot anger. So come what may, I'll not be upset. So come what may, I'll not upset my cheerful happiness of mind. Dejection never brings me what I want. My virtue will be warped and marred by it. So resolve again and again not to allow whatever harm or failure or obstacle or hindrances to disturb your mind's contentment and cheerfulness of tall order. But this is what we're striving for here. We must give rise to this contentment and a cheerful heart as a way to avoid, as a remedy to depression and dejection. And those things never provide what you want. They never bring happiness. And being depressed or being dejected about circumstances or depressed about circumstances never solve circumstances, never change circumstances to favorable. Anyway, you check it out. Unless you're surrounding yourself with sycophants or enablers who don't want you to be depressed and just in an unhealthy, neurotic way, you begin to use your depression and dejection and poutingness to get what you want. But that won't be that won't be in accord with the Bodhisattva conduct. My virtue will be warped and marred by it, so our aim will fail to, our noble aim, our aim that we can put words to this aim, but we can't even conceive of what our aim is yet because of our faulty, narrow knowledge. Our wisdom is so short and small that we can't even conceive of what our aim is, but we can utter it. We can say perfect enlightenment, liberating all sentient beings. We can make those aspiration words come out. Aspiration always precedes action that leads to the fulfillment of those aspirations. So think about this verse here. In other words, this also reminds me of, in the mind training practices, one of the slogans in the mind training is, don't be predictable. Don't be predictable. Why did that remind me of that? Usually when something happens to us, like somebody insults us, then we try to think of something to reply in an insulting way, to combat. Or if somebody wrongly criticizes us, we react in an angry, negative way, and then we hold that and harbor that. That's predictable. It's expected. And culture expects it, society expects it, relationship, allies and supporting groups, expect that. That's very predictable. Somebody, one side sends a bomb and it blows up on the other side, so they're expected to send a bomb back to blow up the other side. Somebody kills somebody from your group, then your code, what's expected of you is to take one out from the other group. That's predictable. Don't be predictable, it says in Lojong. Anyway, that'll come up as we go along here, but that's the idea here, to not give in to the circumstances, but to hold your ground as a bodhisattva. If there's a remedy, and here, this one, 10 says, if there's a remedy when trouble strikes, that is, if trouble strikes, something untoward happens that interrupts your kind of flow, or something unwanted lands in your lap, if something can change the situation, then there's nothing to get resentful about. There's nothing to get depressed about. You just do it. And if there's no help, if something can't be fixed, then, he says here, if there's no help for it, then what's the use there? What use is there in being glum? Glum. What use is there in being glum? So if there's nothing, if you can't resolve the problem, then there's no purpose in getting all tangled up about it. You know, angry, of course this has to do with anger, you know, self-hatred, hating others, whatever it is. There's no point to that when something can't be fixed. And it just aggravates the situation further because you begin to create negative karma in the face of that, or out of that, by that suffering that's produced. And then you produce more suffering. So it's totally not only useless, but it's counterproductive to your well-being. So read this and pay attention to the distinction. If there's something that can be done about it, then do it. If there's nothing, if you bought that thing and it was very clearly said that no returns or exchanges or refunds are available, and you knew that, then when you change your mind, there's no point in getting all upset because you can't get your money back. But you need a method. You know, you do need a method. The point here is cultivating patience. That means moving from anger to less anger, to lesser and lesser anger, to no anger. Through cultivating patience. I think I'll end here tonight. I'll give you a chance to go over these verses one by one and reflect on them, kind of struggle with them, because like it says in the, of course, during the time, from the time of human beings, however many years human beings have been around, but even it's the time of Buddha Shakyamuni. Buddha Shakyamuni taught people that lived 2,500 years ago, and 2,500 years ago, you know, there were no cars, no high tension wires, not much noise, you know, not even many people, you know. Things that really now we kind of crave as being, if only we had things less this and less, you know, no car, you know, all these things that would make us more feel at ease. You know. But Buddha taught then about anger is a big problem. Anger and its sort of cousins, like a jealousy and envy that has this kind of aversion quality to, not envy, but a jealousy, which is kind of like anger with an unfulfilled desire in it. But anger was a big problem, and the Buddha taught specifically as being the big problem is anger. And it has its own chapter. Out of 10 chapters, it has its own chapter, anger. So it's no small matter. And so really try to understand the debilitating effect anger has on our bodhisattva path. We might excuse anger because of certain social or cultural or, like I say, predictable reasons. But before we take a bodhisattva vow, we take refuge. We set our goal on enlightenment. And that bodhisattva vow then enhances that vow to attain enlightenment by having it applied not just to one, but to all sentient beings must attain enlightenment. But we've had that, we took that vow, we carry that responsibility to attain enlightenment in order to ensure the enlightenment of all sentient beings. And that vow of refuge is based on our understanding of impermanence, the unreliability of life. All aspects of life are completely unstable and unreliable. And so we take refuge in enlightenment and an understanding of that unreliability, that impermanence, and that instability of everything is not random, but it follows a certain principle of causation, that everything arises through causes and conditions, that things don't occur outside of causes and conditions. Karma. And since everything is impermanent, and since everything arises through causes and conditions only, then this conditioning is somehow unsatisfactory. There's shortcomings to it. There's no final good that comes from it, because the whole thing is driven by anger, clinging, and stupidity. And so we take refuge from that with either a fear, a disgust, we lose our taste for that cycle of experience, samsara. And so we need to call forth our previous training that leads to renunciation, to develop our compassion, because anger is the enemy of compassion. And so compassion, renunciation, and as in this chapter, it goes into a little bit further detail on the view, the right view. And so in light of your understanding of Dharma, then when you read these verses, see how it all interconnects. Okay, so we'll leave it at that, and we'll dedicate the virtue. Dedicate our virtue of listening and whatever virtue you have for having the technical intelligence to be able to log on and believe that I'm here teaching just because you see a little thing on your screen that's composed of little dots of different colors. You have the karma, the virtue to believe that I'm here doing that. And so dedicate that virtue and the virtue of the subject matter of patience. May all beings, through virtue of my listening to these teachings. May all beings be freed from anger and the other kleshas. May all beings cultivate peace by virtue of my listening to these teachings, the merit of that.